Today, we're diving into the case of Crosley Green. This story really makes you think about guilt, innocence, and how our justice system works. We've got this article here. It's called The Troubling Case of Crosley Green, Justice or Miscarriage of Justice. So is he a victim of a messed up system, or did he actually do it and just, got away with it? Let's see what we can find out.
This case is so interesting because it's not just about one man. It forces us to look at the big problems with the justice system in America, especially how race can affect things.
Right, yeah. So to understand all of this, we got to go back to 1989, small town of Florida. Charles Chip Flynn, he's found murdered in an orange grove. So what happened after that?
Well, the police, they started looking at Crosley Green pretty quickly, mostly because of what Flynn's ex-girlfriend, Kim Halleck, told them.
So her story was like the main evidence they had.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
She said that she and Flynn were carjacked by a black man, and then he drove Flynn to the orange grove and shot him. But here's the thing. They didn't find any evidence at the crime scene that connected Green to the murder.
Wait, hold on. No physical evidence. That's kind of a big deal, isn't it? You'd think that would have made people suspicious back then.
Absolutely. I mean, if there's no evidence putting him at the scene, how strong can their case really be?
So if there's no physical evidence, what else were they going on? Was her story enough to put him away?
Seems like it was. But there's this podcast, Murder in the Orange Grove, and they have a different theory about what happened. They think Halleck might have shot Flynn herself during an argument and then made up the carjacking story to cover it up.
Wow, that's a huge twist. What evidence do they have for that?
Well, they point out some things in Halleck's story that don't really add up, things she said to the police at first, and they talk about reasons she might have had to lie.
Interesting. But even with those problems and no physical evidence, Green was still convicted, and they sentenced him to death in 1990. That's a big punishment, especially with all those questions about the case.
Absolutely. Imagine being on death row for a crime you didn't commit. It's hard to even fathom the impact of something like that, the emotional and psychological toll. Green was released from death row in 2009 after all those appeals, but the article says he was a mess. It's heartbreaking to think about the lasting damage a wrongful conviction can have on someone.
Yeah, it makes you think about how even when justice comes, sometimes it comes too late. But you said he was released in 2009, so is he free now?
He was released, but the legal fight isn't over. This case has become a focal point for all these discussions about the problems with the justice system, racial bias, and how that affects what happens in court.
That's something we see a lot, sadly. Cases like Emmett Till, Susan Smith, all those accusations against black people because of prejudice. It's really tragic.
Exactly. Green's case is unfortunately part of a long and disturbing pattern in America. We have to acknowledge that history of racial injustice, it's still affecting our institutions, like the courts. It makes you wonder how much those biases are still at play, even if it's subconscious,
It's a disturbing thought. But was there anything specific in Green's case that suggests those biases might have been a factor?
The article talks about how Green's case wasn't the only one in Brevard County, Florida. There were at least 3 other cases there. Juan Ramos, Bill Dillon, Wilton Dedge. They were all wrongly convicted, and there are questions about whether the prosecutors did something wrong.
Wow, 3 other cases in the same county. That's a lot. What were those cases about?
Well, Juan Ramos, he was convicted in '83. Only evidence they had was what someone in jail with him said. Turned out he was innocent later. Bill Dillon, he was a young athlete. They said he committed murder in '81, but it was all based on lies and this dog tracking evidence that didn't really mean anything. And Wilton Dedge, he was convicted of rape in '82, even though we didn't even match the description they had. DNA evidence cleared him eventually.
There are some really disturbing similarities there. Jailhouse informants, evidence that's questionable, and then eventually they're all found innocent. It really makes you question how good the investigations and legal processes were in those cases.
And here's the thing. All of those cases, including Green's, were handled by the same prosecutor's office. Makes you wonder if there was a culture in that office where they cared more about getting convictions than about actual justice.
That's a pretty serious accusation. What kinds of problems in the system would allow something like that to happen?
Well, there are a few things. The article talks about how they used evidence that wasn't very reliable, eyewitness accounts that could be wrong, confessions that might have been forced, and bad forensic science. And then you have the jailhouse informants. They often have a reason to lie, maybe to get a better deal for themselves. And then there's things like dog tracking, which is notoriously unreliable.
It's starting to sound like they were so focused on getting a conviction, especially in a big case like this, that they weren't really looking for the truth.
Yeah, and when prosecutors feel that pressure to get convictions. It can be like they have blinders on. They're just trying to build a case, even if it means ignoring evidence that might prove the person is innocent. And that pressure is even worse in cases that get a lot of public attention, where everyone wants to see someone punished quickly.
So you've got potentially biased witnesses, questionable evidence, and a system that's pushing for convictions. That's a recipe for disaster, really.
Exactly. And it brings up a really important question. How do we stop this from happening? How do we make sure the system is actually focused on justice, not just getting convictions?
That's a huge question. But before we get into solutions, let's get back to Crosley Green. Is there any chance he'll finally clear his name after all this time?
There is some hope. Advocacy groups and pro bono lawyers, they've really taken up his case and are trying to get him exonerated. They found new witnesses and are taking another look at all the evidence.
Well, that's good to hear. What's the latest on that, and what are they doing to get justice for him?
Let's take a closer look. So these new witnesses, they're saying they saw Green somewhere else, far away from where the murder happened, at the same time it was happening.
That could really change things. If they're telling the truth, it means the whole story the prosecution told is wrong. Are they going to really check out what these witnesses are saying?
Oh yeah, for sure. Both sides, the prosecution and the defense, they're going to go over those statements with a fine-tooth comb, asking them all kinds of questions about what they remember, how they know Green, anything that could mean they're not being truthful.
It's a big deal, right? If these witnesses are believable, it could change everything for Green. Makes you wonder why they didn't come forward before now.
That's a good question. It does happen sometimes, though, people remembering things later, maybe feeling guilty or just wanting to do the right thing after all these years.
Whatever their reason, it could make a big difference. It shows that even after all this time, new things can come up in a case and change everything.
It really emphasizes how important it is to keep investigating and keep an open mind, even in cases that seem like they're over.
You mentioned earlier about the law firm Crowell and Mooring being involved. What exactly are they doing in Green's case?
They've been really active in trying to get his conviction overturned. They've got a whole team of lawyers working for free, going over all the evidence again, talking to witnesses, and figuring out the best legal strategies.
With a case this complicated, I bet that's a huge help. What are some of the things they might be trying to do, legally speaking?
Well, they could try to use the new witnesses to show that the original conviction was wrong, maybe even try to get a whole new trial. Or they could appeal to a higher court, try to get them to look at the case again and maybe throw out the conviction.
So they're basically looking at every possible legal option to get a fair outcome for Green now that they have this new information.
Yeah, exactly. They're using their skills to work the system and make sure his rights are protected.
It's impressive that they're putting so much effort into this, especially for a firm as big as theirs. It shows that people still believe in fighting for justice, even within a system as complicated as the legal system.
It really does show the power of advocating for what's right. But even with all this hope, we can't forget that the legal system moves slowly and it doesn't always go the way you expect.
That's true. You never know for sure what's going to happen. But at least things are moving, people are paying attention, and new information is coming out. That's got to be a good sign for Green.
It is. And no matter what happens with Green, this whole situation has made people talk about some serious problems with the justice system, especially when it comes to racial bias and how that affects cases.
You've mentioned that a few times now, the idea of systemic bias. Can you explain a little more about what that means and how it might have played a role in Green's case and others?
Systemic bias is tricky, It's not always obvious, but it affects things at every level. How the police investigate, what evidence they collect, who gets picked for the jury, even how long someone's sentence is.
Can you give me some examples of how that bias might actually work in real life?
Well, think about this. There are studies that show Black people are often seen as more dangerous or suspicious just because of their race. That can affect how police treat them, right? They might be more likely to get stopped, searched, arrested, even for little things.
So that bias starts affecting things right from the first encounter with the police, which can snowball into bigger problems later on.
Exactly. And it's not just the police. Even witnesses, they can be influenced by these biases without realizing it. They might remember things differently or see things in a way that fits with their existing beliefs about race.
That's scary to think that even something like eyewitness testimony can be affected by these deep-seated biases.
Yeah.
How much can you really trust it, especially in cases where race is a factor?
That's a big question, and it shows how important it is to be really careful about using eyewitness testimony, especially in cases where racial bias might be at play.
It also makes you think about the importance of having diverse juries, people from different backgrounds who can bring different perspectives to the case.
Exactly. Having diverse juries is so important for making sure trials are fair. If everyone on the jury comes from the same background, those implicit biases can have a much bigger influence on the final decision.
So, to address this bias, we need to look at everything, from the police to the prosecutors to the juries. It's a big job.
It really is. But if we want a justice system that's fair for everyone, no matter their race or background, this is something we have to tackle head on.
It's a goal worth fighting for, and cases like Crosley Green's really show how important it is. But let's get back to his specific case for a minute. What are some of the legal challenges his team is facing as they try to get his conviction overturned?
One of the biggest hurdles they have to clear is the idea of finality in the legal system. Once a conviction is done and all the appeals are finished, it's really hard to reopen the case, even with new evidence.
So the system is basically saying, we've made a decision, case closed, even if there's a chance they got it wrong.
That's basically it. The courts really want to avoid having trials and appeals go on forever. But sometimes that can get in the way of justice, especially when new evidence comes up that could show someone was wrongly convicted.
So Green's lawyers have to make a really strong argument to get the courts to even consider looking at the case again.
Yeah, they have to prove that the new evidence is not only believable, but also strong enough that it could have actually changed the outcome of the trial. And the courts don't like to change their minds, so it's not easy.
Sounds like a real uphill battle. What are some of the arguments they might be using to try to persuade the court?
Well, they could point out that the new witnesses directly contradict what the prosecution said happened, which puts the whole case in doubt. They could also emphasize that there was no physical evidence linking Green to the crime and say that, along with the new witnesses, it's just not clear enough that he's guilty.
So they're basically saying the original trial had some big problems and that justice wasn't really served.
That's the gist of it. They want the courts to look at everything again with fresh eyes.
It's a tough job, but the fact that they're taking it on shows how much they believe in Green's innocence and how dedicated they are to justice.
Absolutely. It shows how important it is to have good lawyers and groups who can fight for people's rights and hold the justice system accountable.
Their work is inspiring. It's a reminder that even within a huge and complex system like this, individuals can make a real difference.
It shows the strength of believing in something and never giving up, even when things seem impossible.
It's really inspiring to see people like that fighting so hard for Green. But, it makes you think about what we can do, even if we're not lawyers or activists. How can we help make the system better, address this systemic bias?
That's the big question, right? We can't just talk about it. We got to do something. Supporting those organizations that are working on these issues, that's a great place to start. Like the Innocence Project, Equal Justice Initiative, NAACP Legal Defense Fund. They're really making a difference, fighting for people who are wrongly convicted, trying to change the law.
So donate to them, volunteer, tell people about what they do. Those are all things we can do.
Exactly. They always need money, but you can also volunteer your time, your skills, help them raise money, or just tell people about them on social media. Whatever you can do. Even little things can add up to big change.
It's like we all have to be part of the solution, right? But besides helping those groups, is there anything else we can do individually?
Your voice, that's powerful. Talk to your elected officials. Tell them this is important to you, that they should be working on this stuff. Talk to your family and friends too, even if it's hard. Sometimes just starting those conversations can make a difference.
Yeah, like a ripple effect, right? Putting pressure on the people in charge to actually do something. It can feel overwhelming though. Like, how can we really fix such a big problem? Are you saying that even little things can help?
I really believe that. Every voice matters, and every action, no matter how small, helps move things in the right direction. This isn't a quick fix, it's a long fight, but we have to keep at it.
This whole deep dive into Crosley Green's case has been really eye-opening. It makes you think about what really is guilt, what's innocence, and if our justice system is really working the way it should.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we have to keep watching those in power and make sure justice is really being served.
Green's story, it's unique, but it also shows a bigger problem that we have to do something about.
It shows how resilient people can be, how important it is to have hope, and to believe that justice is possible, even when things are really tough.
So, as we wrap up today, I want our listeners to feel like they can make a difference. We can all do something to make the world more just and fair.
I agree.
Yeah.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, keep pushing for a better future. The fight for justice isn't over, and we all need to be part of it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed.